The night it all began. The streets of Greenridge were eerily quiet that cold evening, blanketed in a gray fog that seemed to sap the warmth out of the air. A slight breeze picked up stray papers and plastic bags, swirling them around in chaotic patterns before discarding them on the deserted sidewalks. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long, uneven shadows that danced along the pavement. Jamal Thompson, a 14-year-old boy, limped down the sidewalk, leaning heavily on his crutches. His leg, still recovering from a football injury, ached with every step. Despite the pain, Jamal pushed forward, his shabby backpack slung over one shoulder, and his textbooks clutched tightly to his chest. He had just left his best friend's house, where they'd spent hours solving math problems for an upcoming test. Now, with only a few blocks left to his modest home, a strange unease began to creep into his thoughts. The sound of a car engine broke the silence. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as the faint glow of headlights slid across the wet pavement behind him. He resisted the urge to look back, his mother's words echoing in his mind. "Always keep your head down, Jamal. Don't give them a reason." The car slowed. Tires crunched against gravel as it pulled to a stop behind him. Jamal felt his palms begin to sweat, gripping the rubber handles of his crutches tighter. A police cruiser. The unmistakable red and blue lights began to flash, though the siren remained silent. Jamal's legs stiffened, his body instinctively locking in place. "Hey, you, stop." The voice, gruff and commanding, cut through the still air like a whip. Jamal turned slightly, just enough to see the officer stepping out of the vehicle. His name tag gleamed under the dim streetlight. Officer T. Grace. Jamal had heard the name before. In his neighborhood, everyone knew about Thomas Grace. He was infamous for his heavy-handed tactics and his open disdain for people who didn't look like him. Jamal stopped walking, but didn't turn fully. "I'm just going home, sir," he said, his voice trembling but polite. "Home?" Officer Grace's tone was incredulous. He walked toward Jamal, his boots thudding heavily on the pavement. "At this hour, on crutches? What are you really up to?" Jamal swallowed hard. "I was at a friend's house studying. I'm almost home." The officer's lip curled into a sneer. "A friend's house, huh? Empty your pockets." "Now." "I don't have anything, sir," Jamal said, his hands shaking. "Just books in my bag." "Your bag, huh?" Grace stepped closer, towering over the boy. "Hand it over." Jamal hesitated for just a moment, but it was long enough to anger the officer. Grace snatched the backpack out of Jamal's hands, unzipping it with one swift motion. The contents spilled onto the ground. Dog-eared textbooks, a notebook with scribbled equations, and a half-empty pack of gum. Grace kicked the books aside with a scoff. "Books don't prove anything. What else you got?" "Nothing, sir. I swear." "You think I'm stupid." Grace's voice grew louder, his face twisting into an expression of contempt. "People like you always have something to hide." Jamal flinched but didn't respond. He tried to keep his breathing steady, but his body betrayed him, his trembling hands, his darting eyes. Grace seemed to feed off the boy's fear. "Take off the hoodie," Grace barked. Jamal hesitated again. It was cold, and the hoodie was the only thing keeping him warm, but he knew better than to disobey. Slowly, he reached up and pulled the hoodie off, revealing his thin, shivering frame. Grace circled him like a predator stalking prey. "You're out here in the middle of the night, wearing a hoodie, limping around on crutches. What are you really up to?" "I'm not up to anything," Jamal whispered. "I'm just trying to get home." The officer didn't seem to hear him or care. He leaned in close, the smell of coffee and stale tobacco filling the air between them. "Let me make one thing clear, kid. You don't belong here. People like you think you can just wander around wherever you want, but not in my town." Jamal's grip on his crutches tightened. His heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat of panic. He wanted to run, but where could he go? The crutches made escape impossible, and he knew better than to flee from a cop. Grace stepped back and pulled out his walkie-talkie. Suspicious individual. Black male. Late teens. Possibly armed, he said, his voice calm and detached. Jamal's eyes widened. No, sir. I'm not armed. I don't have anything. Shut up, Grace snapped, cutting him off. I don't want to hear it. Before Jamal could respond, Grace reached down and yanked one of the crutches out from under him. Jamal stumbled, losing his balance, and fell hard onto the cold pavement. Pain shot through his injured leg, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation. He could feel the sting of tears welling up in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Grace stood over him, his shadow stretching long and menacing under the streetlights. You think you're tough, huh? You think you can mouth off to me? Jamal shook his head, his voice barely audible. No, sir. Get up. I can't, Jamal stammered, clutching his leg. Grace's expression darkened. I said, get up. He grabbed Jamal by the arm and yanked him to his feet, ignoring the boy's cries of pain. Please, Jamal begged, his voice cracking. I didn't do anything wrong. You did enough, Grace muttered. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them onto Jamal's wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. Jamal stood there, his body trembling, his mind racing. He thought of his mother, Monica Harris, who had always told him to stand tall and stay strong no matter what. She was the district attorney, a woman who had spent her career fighting for justice. But in this moment, Jamal felt anything but strong. As Grace shoved him toward the patrol car, Jamal's mind screamed one desperate thought. Mom will fix this. She has to. But little did he know, this night would not only challenge his own strength, it would ignite a battle that would shake the very foundation of the justice system. The seeds of resistance. The patrol car's interior was stifling, its stale air thick with the faint scent of sweat and old vinyl. Jamal sat in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him, his body leaning awkwardly against the door for balance. Every bump in the road sent sharp pain through his injured leg, but he bit his lip to keep from crying out. Officer Grace sat in the front, his face illuminated by the glow of the dashboard. His expression was unreadable, but Jamal could feel the simmering anger radiating off the man. The streets outside were empty, save for the occasional flicker of light from a passing lamppost. Jamal's mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. How had this happened? He had done nothing wrong. And yet here he was, restrained, humiliated, and entirely at the mercy of a man who seemed to despise him simply for existing. Jamal's thoughts drifted to his mother. Monica Harris wasn't just any prosecutor. She was a force to be reckoned with in the courtroom. Fierce, determined, and unyielding, she had built a reputation for holding the powerful accountable. Jamal knew she would fight for him. But a nagging doubt crept into his mind. What if she can't? What if this time the system wins? The car came to an abrupt stop in a darkened parking lot behind the precinct. Grace got out first, slamming the door behind him, and walked around to Jamal's side. Yanking the door open, he grabbed Jamal by the arm and dragged him out. The teenager stumbled, nearly falling, but Grace's iron grip kept him upright. Move, Grace barked, shoving him toward the station's rear entrance. Jamal's crutches had been left behind in the car, making every step a struggle. His injured leg buckled under his weight, and he gasped in pain. Grace, unimpressed, simply pushed him harder. The hallway they entered was dimly lit, its walls lined with peeling paint and faded posters about community safety. The irony was not lost on Jamal. The detention area was small and poorly maintained, with flickering fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the cracked tiles. Grace shoved Jamal into a hard metal chair and loomed over him, his expression a mix of disdain and satisfaction. "All right, kid," Grace said, leaning in close. "You're gonna tell me exactly what you were doing out there tonight. And don't even think about lying." "I told you," Jamal said, his voice trembling. "I was just going home." Grace scoffed. Going home? At this hour? On crutches? You expect me to believe that? It's the truth, Jamal insisted, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Grace straightened up and crossed his arms. You know I've dealt with your kind before. Always playing the victim, always making excuses. But let me tell you something, kid. You're not fooling anyone. Jamal clenched his fists behind his back, the cold metal of the cuffs digging into his skin. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation for why this was happening to him, but he knew it would only make things worse. Before Grace could continue his interrogation, the door to the room opened and another officer stepped inside. This one was younger, with a nervous energy that contrasted sharply with Grace's swagger. Officer Grace, the younger man said hesitantly. We've got a call from the DA's office. It's Monica Harris. Grace's expression darkened. What does she want? She's asking about her son, the younger officer replied, glancing at Jamal with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She sounds pretty upset. Grace muttered a curse under his breath and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Jamal let out a shaky breath, the tension in his chest easing ever so slightly. The younger officer lingered for a moment, looking at Jamal with an expression that almost resembled guilt. Hang in there, kid, he said quietly before leaving the room. Meanwhile, Monica Harris was pacing her living room, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady, laced with controlled fury. You're telling me my son is in custody, she said, her words clipped and precise. What exactly is he being accused of? The voice on the other end of the line stammered. Ma'am, we're still gathering the details, but Officer Grace reported. Officer Grace. Monica interrupted, her tone icy. Thomas Grace. The same officer who has multiple complaints filed against him for excessive force. The man on the phone hesitated. I believe so, ma'am. Monica's grip on the phone tightened. Listen to me carefully. I want my son released immediately, and I want a full report of what happened tonight on my desk by morning. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am, the man replied hurriedly. We'll get that report to you right away. Monica ended the call and took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had spent years navigating the complexities of the justice system, but this was different. This was personal. Her son had been targeted, humiliated, and detained without cause, and she was determined to make sure those responsible were held accountable. Back at the station, Grace returned to the room where Jamal was being held. His face was flushed with anger, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Well, kid, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Looks like your mom's got some pull. She's raising quite the fuss. Jamal didn't respond. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his hand still clenched behind his back. Grace leaned against the table, staring down at him. You think this changes anything? You think your mom's gonna scare me? I've been doing this job a long time, kid. People like her come and go, but I'm still here. Jamal finally looked up, meeting Grace's gaze with a quiet defiance that surprised even himself. She's not just my mom, he said softly. She's the district attorney, and she's not going to let you get away with this. For a brief moment, Grace faltered. The weight of Jamal's words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time that night, the officer seemed unsure of himself. But the moment passed quickly, and he straightened up, his sneer returning. We'll see about that, he said, turning toward the door. Enjoy your stay, kid. As the door slammed shut behind him, Jamal closed his eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. He didn't know what would happen next, but he clung to one thought, one hope. His mother was coming, and she would not stop until justice was served. A mother's wrath. The cool pre-dawn air cut through Monica Harris as she stepped out of her car in the police station parking lot. Dressed in a sharp black suit, her every movement radiated purpose and fury. Her normally calm demeanor had been replaced with an intensity that made her seem taller, more commanding. The station's fluorescent lights flickered weakly against the encroaching shadows, but Monica's presence was a beacon of clarity in the gloom. She had spent the hours after that fateful phone call piecing together every scrap of information she could find on Officer Thomas Grace. Complaints, eyewitness accounts, and internal reports painted a damning picture of a man who had abused his badge repeatedly, shielded by a culture that turned a blind eye. Now, with her son in his clutches, Monica was ready to wield every ounce of her authority to expose him and the system that protected him. As she approached the front desk, the young officer stationed there immediately stiffened. His nervous smile faltered under Monica's piercing gaze. "I'm Monica Harris," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm here to see my son, Jamal Thompson, and I expect immediate compliance." The officer swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I'll notify." "You'll notify no one," Monica snapped, cutting him off. "You'll take me to him right now. And if there's any delay, I will personally ensure you're held accountable for obstruction." The officer blinked, stunned into silence. Without another word, he gestured toward the hallway leading to the holding area. Inside the station, Jamal sat slumped in the cold, hard chair, his body aching from the night's events. His wrists were raw from the cuffs, and his injured leg throbbed with every shift in position. He stared at the floor, replaying the events over and over in his mind. Each humiliating moment seemed etched into his memory, but alongside the fear was a flicker of hope. He knew his mother, and he knew she wouldn't let this go. The door to the room burst open, and Monica stepped inside. The sight of her son's bruised face and trembling frame sent a surge of fury through her, but she forced herself to remain composed. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. "Jamal," she said, her voice softening as she crossed the room to him. She knelt by his side, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Are you okay, baby?" Jamal nodded weakly, his eyes filling with tears. "I'm fine, Mom." "No, you're not," Monica said, her tone hardening again as she stood and turned toward the door. "But I'll make sure you will be." In the main precinct, Officer Thomas Grace leaned casually against a counter, chatting with a colleague. He exuded confidence, even smugness, as though the events of the night were just another routine exercise of his authority. When he saw Monica walking toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, his smirk deepened. "You must be the prosecutor," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Quite the fuss you're making over nothing." Monica stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest. "Officer Grace," she said evenly, though her eyes burned with controlled rage. "I've reviewed your record. Dozens of complaints, accusations of excessive force, racial profiling, abuse of power. And now you've added my son to your list of victims." Grace shrugged, unfazed. "I've done nothing outside the bounds of the law, ma'am. Your son was acting suspiciously, and I acted accordingly." "Suspiciously," Monica echoed, her voice rising. "Walking home on crutches is suspicious to you." "He didn't comply," Grace said, his tone hardening. "He resisted." Monica took a step closer, her anger barely contained. "He's 14 years old. On crutches. What exactly did you expect him to do?" Grace's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Monica took another step forward, her voice now a low, dangerous whisper. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? You think this badge gives you the right to terrorize innocent people, to humiliate a child who did nothing wrong? Well, you're about to find out just how wrong you are." Grace straightened, his smirk faltering slightly. "Ma'am, with all due respect." "Don't," Monica interrupted, her voice cutting through the room. "Don't you dare talk to me about respect. You don't know the meaning of the word." The room had gone silent, the other officers watching the confrontation with a mixture of awe and unease. Monica turned her attention to the officer at the desk. "I want my son released immediately," she demanded. "And I want every piece of evidence related to his detention, the arrest report, body camera footage, surveillance tapes, on my desk by noon." The officer hesitated, glancing nervously at Grace. "Ma'am, the footage." "Don't," Monica said sharply, her gaze snapping to him. "Don't you dare tell me the cameras weren't working. Don't you dare tell me the tapes were lost. I've heard every excuse this department has to offer, and I'm not buying it." Jamal was finally released from the holding area, his cuffs removed and his belongings returned. Monica held his hand tightly as they walked out of the station together, her every step purposeful and deliberate. The crowd of reporters waiting outside erupted into a frenzy of questions and flashing cameras, but Monica ignored them, focused entirely on getting her son to safety. Once they were in the car, Jamal turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's going to happen now?" Monica's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Now," she said, her voice firm, "we fight. Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been in your shoes. This stops here." As they drove away from the station, Monica's mind raced with plans. She would call every journalist she knew, subpoena every document they tried to withhold, and hold every officer involved accountable. This wasn't just about her son anymore. This was about justice, about dismantling a system that had failed too many for too long. In the days to come, Monica's fight would shake the foundations of the department. It would expose not just Thomas Grace, but the network of complicity that had allowed him to thrive. And as the truth came to light, Monica's determination would inspire others to stand up, to speak out, and to demand a world where no child would ever have to face what her son had endured. The battle had only just begun. The unraveling truth. The morning after Jamal's release, Monica Harris sat in her home office, surrounded by a mountain of papers, files, and her laptop streaming news coverage of the incident. The video footage recorded by a bystander had already gone viral, showing Jamal's frail figure on crutches being manhandled and tasered by Officer Thomas Grace. Outrage had spread like wildfire. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags calling for justice, and local news channels aired panel discussions debating the case. But Monica wasn't focused on the noise. Her attention was on the hard evidence she had spent the early hours gathering. Complaints filed against Officer Grace painted a picture of unchecked authority and systemic negligence. Yet every one of those complaints had been dismissed under dubious circumstances. Witness accounts had been ignored, and internal investigations had consistently found him not guilty of misconduct. It wasn't just about Grace anymore. It was about the system that enabled him. At the police department, Grace was beginning to feel the heat. The atmosphere in the station had shifted. His colleagues, once quick to back him up with a pat on the back and dismissive jokes, now avoided eye contact. The video of Jamal's arrest had sparked a firestorm, and officers who once viewed Grace as untouchable were beginning to question whether the fallout would take them down with him. In a tense morning meeting, the department's leadership addressed the elephant in the room. Chief Randall, a grizzled veteran with decades of experience, stood at the front of the room, his expression grim. "This is a mess," Randall began, his voice heavy. "The public is demanding answers, and Harris isn't going to let this slide. We're already fielding calls from the mayor's office and the governor. I don't need to tell you what that means." Grace leaned back in his chair, feigning nonchalance. "We're cops. We acted within the law. The kid was non-compliant. I followed procedure." Randall's glare pinned him to his seat. "Procedure doesn't include tasering a teenager on crutches. Grace, you've put us all in the spotlight, and not in a good way." Another officer spoke up, his tone cautious. "What about the body cam footage? Shouldn't it back up Grace's actions?" Randall hesitated, then sighed. The body cams were off. The room erupted in whispers and exchanged glances. Grace smirked, but the unease in the room was palpable. Monica, meanwhile, had no time for whispers or half measures. She was already working on a press statement when her phone buzzed. It was a text from her assistant. "Got something big. Anonymous source dropped this off." Attached was a photo of a USB drive sitting on Monica's desk at the office. Monica's heart raced. The anonymous source had already called once before, hinting at suppressed evidence. If this drive contained what she hoped, it could be the smoking gun she needed. An hour later, sitting in her office chair, Monica plugged the drive into her laptop. Her assistant hovered nearby, nervously wringing her hands. The folder contained several video files, timestamps matching the night of Jamal's arrest. Monica clicked on the first file, her heart pounding. The footage, recorded by Grace's patrol car camera, showed Jamal walking down the sidewalk, clutching his crutches. Grace's voice came through, low and sneering. "Look at this," he muttered. "What's this kid doing out here?" The footage captured everything. The unwarranted stop, Grace's aggressive interrogation, the unnecessary use of force. It was damning. Monica leaned back in her chair, her fists clenched. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is the truth." The next morning, Monica held a press conference on the steps of the courthouse. Dozens of reporters crowded around her, microphones thrust forward, cameras clicking incessantly. Jamal stood beside her, his crutches steady under his arms, his face pale but determined. "Good morning," Monica began, her voice clear and steady. "Last week, my son, Jamal, was subjected to an egregious abuse of power by Officer Thomas Grace. Since then, I have uncovered evidence not only of Grace's misconduct, but also of a systemic failure within the police department to hold him accountable." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Today, I am releasing unedited footage from Grace's patrol car. This footage shows the truth, the harassment, the violence, and the disregard for human dignity. It is time for this department to answer for its actions." As Monica spoke, her assistant handed USB drives containing the footage to each journalist in attendance. Within minutes, the footage was online, shared across news networks and social media platforms. The outrage that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Inside the police station, chaos erupted as the footage went public. Officers huddled around computer screens, their faces pale as they watched the undeniable evidence of Grace's actions. Chief Randall called an emergency meeting, his voice shaking with anger. "This is a disaster," he said, slamming his fist on the table. "Grace, you've brought this entire department under fire." Grace, for once, was silent. His usual bravado had been replaced with a quiet tension. He knew he was losing control of the narrative. Monica's battle was far from over. As public pressure mounted, she filed a formal lawsuit against the department, demanding not only justice for Jamal, but also sweeping reforms to address the systemic issues that had allowed Grace to operate unchecked. The lawsuit sparked national attention. Civil rights groups rallied behind Monica, while protests erupted outside the police station, demanding accountability. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Jamal" and "End Police Brutality" filled the streets. Monica worked tirelessly, building a coalition of advocates, lawyers, and community leaders. Together, they uncovered more stories of abuse, more evidence of cover-ups, and more reasons to fight. For Monica, this wasn't just about her son anymore. It was about changing a system that had failed too many for too long. In a quiet moment at home, Jamal sat with his mother, the weight of the past week pressing down on them both. "Mom," he said softly, "why are you doing all this? Why not just get justice for me and move on?" Monica looked at her son, her expression softening. "Because, Jamal, if we don't fight, who will? What happened to you isn't just about you. It's about every kid who's been told they don't matter. It's about standing up and saying, 'Enough.'" Jamal nodded, a flicker of determination sparking in his eyes. "Then I want to help. I want to fight too." Monica smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "You already are, baby. Just by being brave, you're making a difference." As mother and son sat together, the storm outside continued to rage. But in their hearts, there was a growing sense of hope, a belief that, no matter how long or hard the fight, justice would prevail. And they were ready to see it through to the end. The fight for justice. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, and the gallery buzzed with quiet conversations. The air was heavy with anticipation, a palpable tension that seemed to vibrate off the walls. At the front of the room, the judge's bench loomed, its imposing presence commanding respect. Monica Harris sat at the plaintiff's table, her sharp suit and composed demeanor masking the storm raging inside her. To her left sat Jamal, dressed in a crisp white shirt and black tie. Despite his outward calm, his fingers fidgeted with the edges of his crutches, his knuckles pale from the pressure. This wasn't just another court hearing. It was the opening salvo in a battle that would determine not only justice for Jamal, but the accountability of an entire police department. At the defense table sat Officer Thomas Grace, flanked by his legal team. Grace's usual swagger was subdued, replaced by a stiffness that betrayed his growing unease. His lawyer, a seasoned defender of law enforcement, radiated confidence, his sharp suit and polished arguments ready to challenge Monica at every turn. "All rise," the bailiff called, signaling the arrival of Judge Elaine Carter, a woman known for her no-nonsense approach and unwavering commitment to fairness. As she entered, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. "You may be seated," Judge Carter said, her voice even but firm. She glanced down at the papers in front of her, then looked up at the courtroom. "This case involves serious allegations against Officer Thomas Grace and the Green Ridge Police Department. I expect decorum and professionalism from all parties involved. Let's proceed." The plaintiff's case began with Monica taking the floor. As lead prosecutor in her son's case, she knew she carried the weight of not just her family's pain, but the collective outrage of a community betrayed by its protectors. "Your Honor," Monica began, her voice clear and resolute, "this case is not only about the injustice suffered by my son, Jamal Thompson. It is about a system that has allowed officers like Thomas Grace to abuse their power without consequence. My son's arrest was not just unlawful, it was a blatant act of racial profiling, excessive force, and a gross violation of his rights." She turned to the jury, her gaze piercing. "You will see evidence that Officer Grace stopped Jamal without probable cause, humiliated him, and used a taser on a teenager who posed no threat. You will also hear about a history of misconduct by this officer, a history that the Green Ridge Police Department chose to ignore." As Monica spoke, the jurors listened intently, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. Even Judge Carter's normally impassive face betrayed a flicker of concern. The prosecution's first piece of evidence was the video footage from Grace's patrol car, the anonymous source's critical contribution. The room fell silent as the video played on a large screen. It showed Grace's car pulling up behind Jamal, his gruff voice ordering the boy to stop, and the subsequent escalation of force. The footage was damning. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the video captured Grace yanking the crutches away, shoving Jamal to the ground, and deploying his taser with a cold detachment that sent shivers down spines. Monica paused the video at the moment Jamal's body crumpled to the pavement. "This," she said, her voice trembling with controlled anger, "is the face of police brutality. A 14-year-old child, humiliated and injured, for no reason other than the color of his skin, and the biases of a man who swore to protect and serve." Grace's lawyer immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is inflammatory." "It's evidence," Judge Carter interjected. "Overruled. Continue, Ms. Harris." The defense countered with a narrative designed to paint Grace as a hardworking officer doing a difficult job. They argued that Jamal's behavior, his hesitation to comply, his nervousness, had justified Grace's actions. Grace himself took the stand, his demeanor calculated and rehearsed. "I didn't know he was a kid," Grace said, his voice low and measured. "I saw someone walking suspiciously late at night in an area with a history of break-ins. I followed protocol. If I made mistakes, it wasn't out of malice." Monica watched him carefully, her jaw tightening with every word. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached the witness stand with deliberate steps, her eyes locking onto Grace's. "Officer Grace," she began, her tone sharp, "you've stated that you followed protocol. Is that correct? Yes, Grace replied, his voice steady. Then why were your body cameras conveniently turned off that night? Grace hesitated, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. It was a technical issue. A technical issue, Monica repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. Convenient, isn't it, that your cameras seem to malfunction during incidents like these? Isn't it true that your department has received multiple complaints about similar technical issues? Grace's lawyer objected, but Monica pressed on. And isn't it also true, Officer Grace, that you have faced over a dozen complaints for excessive force and racial profiling? Complaints that were either dismissed or ignored. I've never been disciplined, Grace said defensively. Because the system protected you, Monica shot back, her voice rising. Not because you were innocent. The turning point came when Monica called an unexpected witness. Officer Bradley Mills, a junior officer from Grace's precinct. Mills had contacted Monica privately, expressing guilt over what he described as a culture of silence within the department. Against the advice of his colleagues, he had agreed to testify. Officer Mills, Monica said, can you describe the environment in your precinct regarding complaints against officers? Mills shifted nervously but spoke clearly. There's an unspoken rule. You don't go against your own. Complaints are swept under the rug, and officers like Grace are protected. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the weight of Mills's words hitting like a sledgehammer. And have you witnessed Officer Grace acting improperly before? Monica asked. Mills hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he's used excessive force in situations where it wasn't necessary. But no one speaks up because they're afraid of retaliation. As the trial stretched on, the community outside grew louder. Protests swelled, with citizens demanding accountability not just for Grace but for the department as a whole. Signs and chants filled the streets. Justice for Jamal. Reform the system. No more silence. Inside the courtroom, Monica fought tirelessly, dismantling the defense's arguments piece by piece. Her closing statement was a masterclass in passion and precision. This case is not just about my son, she said, her voice echoing through the room. It's about every child who has been told they don't belong. Every citizen who has been treated as less than human. Officer Grace is not an anomaly. He is a symptom of a system that has lost its way. But we have a chance, right here, right now, to say enough, to demand better, to hold those in power accountable. The jury deliberated for 3 tense days. When they finally returned, the courtroom was packed once again, the air so thick with anticipation it was almost suffocating. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Carter asked. The foreperson stood, her voice steady. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of unlawful use of force, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps and cheers erupted, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Monica closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her. Jamal squeezed her hand, a small smile breaking through his solemn expression. It was a victory, but Monica knew the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The system that had enabled Grace still stood, and there was much work to be done. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to savor the triumph of justice prevailing, however imperfectly. The storm was far from over, but the winds of change had begun to blow, and Monica Harris was ready to see it through to the end. A new dawn. The aftermath of the trial reverberated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The guilty verdict against Officer Thomas Grace marked a seismic shift, not only in the Greenridge Police Department, but in the broader community. The once invisible stories of abuse, corruption, and systemic neglect had been dragged into the light, sparking a wave of reckoning that few could have anticipated. For Monica Harris, the journey was far from over. She knew the verdict was only the first step in a much longer fight, a fight to dismantle the structures that had allowed officers like Grace to operate unchecked for so long. A month after the trial, Monica found herself addressing a packed auditorium at a town hall meeting. The room was filled with community members, journalists, activists, and even a few officers from the Greenridge Police Department. The atmosphere crackled with a mixture of hope and urgency. Monica stood at the podium, her presence commanding. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Tonight, we're here to talk about accountability, not just for Officer Grace, but for the system that protected him. The verdict we achieved was a victory, but it is not the end of our work. It is a call to action." She paused, scanning the room. "We must address the root causes of these abuses: racial profiling, lack of oversight, and a culture of silence. This starts with structural change: independent oversight boards, mandatory body cameras, and regular audits of police conduct." Applause erupted, punctuated by shouts of support from the crowd. Monica continued, her words resonating with the urgency of someone who had seen the damage firsthand. "And let me be clear," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "This is not about vilifying all officers. It's about ensuring that the badge represents protection, not oppression. We owe it to our children to build a system they can trust." Jamal sat in the front row, listening intently. The past months had been a whirlwind for him. Therapy sessions to process the trauma, interviews with journalists, and endless conversations with his mom about what came next. He had struggled to find his footing after the ordeal, but his mother's unwavering determination had inspired him. She hadn't just fought for him. She had fought for everyone. After the town hall, Jamal approached Monica as she stepped off the stage. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I want to help." Monica smiled, her eyes softening. "You already are, baby." "No," Jamal insisted. I want to do more. I want to talk to kids at school, tell them what happened to me, and help them understand that they don't have to stay silent." Monica's smile widened. "That's a powerful idea, Jamal, and I think it's exactly what we need right now." Jamal's story became a cornerstone of the community's push for reform. He spoke at schools, community centers, and even youth detention facilities, sharing his experience with honesty and vulnerability. His words resonated deeply, especially with young people who had felt powerless in the face of similar injustices. "I thought I didn't matter," Jamal told one group of students. "I thought no one would believe me. But my mom showed me that we do matter, that our voices can change things." The students listened intently, some nodding, others wiping away tears. Jamal's story was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was a path forward. Meanwhile, Monica continued her relentless pursuit of systemic change. She filed a civil lawsuit against the Greenridge Police Department, demanding reparations not only for Jamal, but for the countless others who had suffered under its flawed system. The lawsuit uncovered a trove of internal documents, emails, memos, and reports that painted a damning picture of the department's culture of impunity. One particularly shocking revelation was an internal memo that explicitly advised officers to focus on certain demographics during patrols in high-crime areas. Monica held a press conference to expose the memo, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "This document," she said, holding it up for the cameras, "is proof of a systemic problem. It's not just about one officer. It's about a mindset that dehumanizes entire communities. This cannot and will not be tolerated." The revelations galvanized the community. Protests grew larger, more organized, and more focused. Activists demanded independent investigations, while local leaders pushed for legislative reforms. Despite the growing momentum, Monica and Jamal faced their share of challenges. Death threats arrived in the mail, and online trolls flooded their social media accounts with hateful messages. Grace's supporters, though dwindling in number, remained vocal, accusing Monica of trying to destroy good cops and turn the system against itself. But Monica remained undeterred. "If they're afraid of change," she told Jamal one evening, "it means we're doing something right." 6 months after the trial, a major breakthrough came. The Greenridge City Council voted unanimously to establish an independent civilian oversight board. The board, composed of community members, legal experts, and activists, would have the authority to review police conduct, investigate complaints, and recommend disciplinary actions. The council also approved funding for implicit bias training, mental health resources for officers, and community policing initiatives. Monica stood beside the mayor as the new measures were announced, her presence a testament to the power of persistence and courage. "This is just the beginning," she told the assembled crowd. "Real change takes time, but tonight, we've taken an important step forward." For Jamal, the journey was equally transformative. He went from being a scared teenager caught in a nightmare to a young leader inspiring others. His speeches became more confident, his voice stronger, and with each story he heard from others who had experienced similar injustices, his resolve grew. One evening, after a particularly emotional talk at a youth center, Jamal sat on the hood of his mother's car, staring at the city skyline. Monica joined him, handing him a bottle of water. "You were amazing tonight," she said, pride shining in her eyes. Jamal smiled, but his expression turned serious. "Do you think things will really change, Mom? I mean for good." Monica looked at him, her gaze steady. "I think change is like planting a tree. You don't see it grow overnight, but if you nurture it, it becomes something strong and lasting. What we're doing now, Jamal, it's planting seeds, and one day this city will be better because of it." A year after the trial, Greenridge felt like a different place. The streets still bore the scars of its past, but there was a new energy, a new hope. The Oversight Board had already made strides in holding officers accountable, and community trust was slowly being rebuilt. As Jamal walked to school one morning on his own 2 feet, his crutches no longer needed, he passed a mural painted on the side of a community center. It depicted a boy standing tall, holding a broken pair of crutches in one hand and a glowing torch in the other. The words beneath it read, "Our voices matter." Jamal stopped and stared at the mural for a long time. A smile crept across his face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but they had come so far. Together, they had proven that even in the face of injustice, courage and resilience could light the way forward. And this was only the beginning. The mural had become a symbol of hope, not just for Jamal, but for the entire community. As Jamal stood there, gazing at the vibrant image, a small crowd began to gather. Children on their way to school stopped to point and smile, their parents explaining the story behind the art. Some of them recognized Jamal and waved, their faces filled with gratitude and admiration. One older man approached, leaning heavily on a cane. His weathered face broke into a wide smile as he extended a hand. "You're Jamal, aren't you?" The boy who stood up to them. Jamal hesitated but then shook the man's hand. "Yes, sir. I guess so." The man nodded, his eyes misting over. "You gave us hope, son. Hope that things can get better." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Monica continued to work tirelessly on behalf of the community, pushing for deeper reforms and greater transparency. Jamal, meanwhile, had found his voice as an advocate for change. He began working with local youth organizations, sharing his story and encouraging others to speak out against injustice. One evening, Jamal and Monica sat together in their living room, reviewing a draft of a speech he was scheduled to give at a state conference on police reform. The room was quiet except for the scratching of a pen and the occasional rustle of papers. Outside, the city hummed with life, but within their home, there was a calm determination. "Mom," Jamal said suddenly, looking up from his notes, "do you ever wonder if we're really making a difference?" Monica looked at him, her face softening. "All the time," she admitted. "But then I think about all the people who've come forward because of what we've done. I think about that mural, about the laws we've helped change, and about you standing in front of people, telling your story. That's the difference, Jamal. It may not feel big now, but it's growing." Jamal nodded, her words settling deep in his heart. "I want to do more, Mom. I want to make sure no one ever feels as scared and helpless as I did that night." "You will," Monica said with a smile. "You already are." Months later, the Green Ridge community gathered for an event at the city square, celebrating the anniversary of the reforms. A stage had been set up, and speakers from all walks of life shared their stories of struggle and triumph. Monica was among them, her words inspiring the crowd with a vision of a brighter, more just future. When it was Jamal's turn to speak, the audience erupted into applause. He stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding, but his resolve steady. The boy who had once been silenced by fear now stood tall, his voice echoing across the square. "Good evening," he began, his tone clear and confident. "A year ago, I was just a kid trying to get home. What happened that night changed my life forever. But it also taught me something important. Our voices matter. What we say, what we stand for, it matters." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "I'm not here because I'm special or brave. I'm here because I had someone who believed in me, who fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. My mom showed me that change isn't just possible, it's necessary." The crowd cheered, but Jamal held up a hand to quiet them. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about building a community where no one has to fear the people who are supposed to protect them. It's about standing together and saying, 'Enough.'" His voice grew stronger, filled with passion. "We've made progress, but the fight isn't over. It's up to all of us to keep pushing, to keep demanding better. Because when we stand together, we can change anything." The applause was deafening, and Jamal stepped back from the microphone, his chest swelling with pride. He glanced at his mother, who was clapping with tears streaming down her face. In that moment, he knew that their fight had been worth it. As the event wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Jamal and Monica lingered near the stage. The city lights twinkled around them, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. "Proud of you, kid," Monica said, pulling Jamal into a hug. "I learned from the best," Jamal replied with a grin. They stood there for a while, watching as people shared stories and plans for the future. The mural on the community center loomed in the background, its bold colors illuminated by the glow of the streetlights. The fight for justice wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. Green Ridge was changing, and with it, the hope for a better tomorrow was growing stronger. As Monica and Jamal walked home together, side by side, they knew one thing for certain. Their voices had sparked a revolution, and they wouldn't stop until every corner of their community, and the world beyond, knew the power of courage, resilience, and the unshakable belief that justice belongs to everyone.